Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs, and in this next segment, we're going to hear panelists from the Munich Security Convention, hashtag MSC 2022. And in that, Dr. Tedros is on the panel from the WHO, and he is going to give some comments about the global preparedness for another pandemic, as we might be seeing the end of this pandemic in maybe the next months or year. And long and short of it is, he's going to state that if it were to happen all over again, our world would still not be prepared for another pandemic. The way we would still be in the same state we are today. When we consider, and he's going to quote this, about 83% of Africa has not been vaccinated. There are still large areas in the Americas that have not been vaccinated or have inadequate treatment for COVID-19, because not only do we have vaccines, but we also have antiviral medications to help with the treatment for those who get sick. And the point is Dr. Tedros and the team at the WHO have pointed out that without equity for all these things to be passed along to all countries, regardless of their ability to pay, puts the whole world at jeopardy for another pandemic to happen. So let's listen to the panelists at the Munich Security Conference 2022.
I'm happy.
Hello.
Okay.
So the title, of course, of this session is Get Well Soon, Finding a Way Out of the Global Pandemic. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists. Her Excellency, the Foreign Minister of Canada, Melanie Joly. Her Excellency, Anna Lund, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Sweden. Comfort Iro, the CEO of the International Crisis Group. And Bill Gates, the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, Dr. Tedros will be joining us a little bit later on in the program. He's been held up. He's on his way from Brussels, and as soon as he gets here, we'll go to him for a few minutes for a bit of a scene setter. But I wanted to kick off, actually, and get a bit of a scene setter from Mr. Gates, because this is, I know, a topic that you've spoken on again and again. You were ahead of the curve prior to the beginning of this pandemic. Where would you assess where we are today in beating COVID-19?
Well, sadly, the virus itself, particularly the variant called Omicron, is a type of vaccine. That is, it creates both B-cell and T-cell immunity, and it's done a better job of getting out to the world population than we have with vaccines. If you do surveys in African countries, you get well over 80% of people have been exposed either to the vaccine or to various variants. And so, what that does is it means the chance of severe disease, which is mainly associated with being elderly and having obesity or diabetes, those risks are now dramatically reduced because of that infection exposure. And, it's sad. We didn't do a great job on therapeutics. Only here, 2 years in, do we have a good therapeutic. Vaccines, it took us 2 years to be in oversupply. Today, there are more vaccines than there is demand for vaccines. And that wasn't true. And next time we should try and make it, instead of 2 years, we should make it more like 6 months, which certainly, some of the standardized platform approaches, including mRNA, would allow us to do that. So, it took us a lot longer this time than it should have.
What's your greatest concern at this time in terms of combating COVID-19 and the potential for another pandemic? Are we going to see another pandemic before we are able to beat this one?
Well, we'll have another pandemic. It will be a different pathogen next time. We'll have some rebound. This pathogen, we don't have a tool to do eradication. We'd like to have a new generation of vaccines that would be suitable. I mean, ideally, we'd get rid of families of respiratory viruses, including the flu family and the coronavirus family. And I do think in the next decade we can come up with an eradication vaccine. That's an aspiration, not a guarantee, but we should put R&D dollars into that. There's already a lot of work that's been done on a universal flu vaccine, and the data on that looks very promising. So we'll have rebounds, but they'll be more typical seasonal flu levels, where, of course, we don't generally shut things down, although in the future some degree of mask wearing probably will be indicated, but we won't get death levels at the kind of acute level that we're still experiencing today as the Omicron wave passes through on a global basis.
Comfort, weigh in for us on the danger level that we're seeing globally at this point in terms of the danger of this pandemic and its impact on society.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear me through the mic. We've tended to see, or there's a tendency to see it as strictly a public health issue, but what we've witnessed also since the emergence of the pandemic is that it has both political implications, social implications, and security implications. We've seen how COVID has exacerbated crises in a number of war-torn or conflict-affected countries. We've seen how COVID has had an impact on humanitarian fallout already in countries that are already vulnerable. For example, in the Sahel, in East Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, in Colombia, in Venezuela. We've seen countries that are already under strain, where you've seen already discontent against government. We've already seen stresses in those countries. We've seen the economic fallout from COVID, but we've also seen a degree of resilience in certain communities as well. So the picture that was painted was that Africa would suffer the worst from it, that conflicts would increase, that there will be more stresses and more strains in a number of communities on the continent. But the continent has also shown itself to be resilient as well. But we have seen the sharp edge of COVID. We have seen the discontent. We have seen the grievances. We've also seen certain governments, certain leaders misuse COVID to put in place more stricter rules, more stringent rules to close the political space. We've seen some countries use it as a way to encroach further on the rule of law as well. So we've seen it play out. So again, while there's been a tendency to focus on the public health dimension of COVID, I think it's important to understand the fallout both in the humanitarian sphere, the economic sphere, political sphere, and what that has meant, particularly for countries that are already vulnerable on the eve of the pandemic as well.
How disturbing is it to you that we see regimes like China and various other authoritarian governments taking advantage of the fact that they are able to control the populations to a much higher degree as a result of having access to their medical information and access to their movements via these apps and other devices that supposedly are keeping people safe, but at the same time allow governments a backdoor into people's lives?
Yeah, and this is a point I was saying, that we've seen certain governments, and I wouldn't target one particular government. I think we've seen already in those in those societies where we've seen an authoritarian trend or where there's been an authoritarian drift, we've seen certain countries try to use it as an excuse, for example, to slow down elections, as an excuse, for example, to go after the opposition, as an excuse, for example, to use the police to clamp down on the movement of their societies as well. So it's particularly in those countries where you've already seen a standoff between their governments and society, those countries where there's already deep distrust. But these aren't just countries where that are conflict-ridden. This is countries where the governance structures of those countries were already weak, were already fragile, and there was already contestation between governments and their society as well.
Yeah, and beyond just the most vulnerable countries, that's also happening in democracies in the West, most particularly in Canada. I know that they were arresting people in Ottawa who've been protesting vaccine mandates earlier today. Foreign Minister, I'd love it if you would address that for us, because that's a deep concern to many in the West, that it seems as if your Prime Minister does not have a handle on the situation.
Well, first and foremost, I think we can be proud of Canadians that have decided to get a vaccine, and we're now at a level of 80%. For all the population of Canada's kids 5 years old and up. And also, I think that we're now starting the third year of the pandemic, Hadley. People are tired, exasperated. In French, there's a saying where I come from in Canada, which we say people are tanné, they're fed up. And, you know, it is a Nordic country, and January and February are harsh months. And so at this point, definitely the mental health of Canadians is something that I have in mind and that we have in mind. Meanwhile, there's a right for peaceful protest in Canada, and we obviously want to make sure that that right is upheld, but we're past that at this point. And our biggest concern, and my biggest concern as Foreign Affairs Minister, is the foreign interference that is happening in the convoy we're seeing in Canada right now. The disinformation campaign, where it comes from, the financing of it, where it comes from. And so we know that obviously there are Canadians that have gone and protested in a peaceful manner, but there are also within the truckers' convoy some elements that are extremely preoccupying, and that led to also criminal charges, including particularly at the Coutts border between the U.S. and Canada, where there were criminal charges laid up and also arms that were seized.
Do you believe that Donald Trump specifically has a role in what's happening in Canada?
Listen, as Foreign Affairs Minister, I won't point out somebody in particular, but we know that there is foreign interference, and that's why also we decided to go ahead and use for the first time in our country the Emergencies Act, which is an important legislation that at the same time gives authority to the government to act through its executive order, but at the same time that needs support from Parliament, and that provides also for a mandatory public hearing after its use. So we know that everything we're doing right now will be under the scrutiny of a public hearing.
Yeah.
So based on that...
These are major pieces of legislation under this Emergency Act. I mean, freezing the bank accounts of people who don't want to get vaccinated, that is a rather draconian step, no?
Well, it is for people that have been parked in front of Ottawa's Parliament and going against basically the legislation and also a lot of the bylaws. You know, as a parliamentarian in Canada, and as a minister, I don't have security. None of us have security. We don't need security usually in Canada. For every parliamentarian to go to Parliament for the last 3 weeks, we have been escorted by the police to basically continue our work, which we were elected to do. And so it's a national security threat. We took, the Prime Minister took this step very seriously, and we're going ahead. But also, there is strong support in Canada for going ahead, because at the same time, we need to make sure that we deal with this national security issue. And more than that, we need to bring more appeasement to the country right
Do you think this is your January 6th moment, in a sense?
No, because the posture of the government is not the same. But at the same time, it is clearly the first time that Canada is using this legislation. And this legislation has strong safeguards in it. We're not using neither the army, or it is within the work of the police officers right now. And we've said many times, we agree with the peaceful protests, at least, but at the same time, residents in Ottawa in particular need to be able to continue their lives. Shops need to be open again. Businesses have suffered from this, and it is important that we continue to have a strong democracy, and parliamentarians need to be able to do their work.
Yeah. Foreign Minister Lund, I want to bring you in here because when we talk about Sweden, I mean, the Foreign Minister, Melanie, was just saying that Canada is a country that's pretty far up there in terms of latitude. When you're talking about Sweden, though, you're also obviously a Nordic country, and you've taken a very different approach to COVID. You have decided to declare the pandemic over. That was partially economic, but also about mental health as well. Walk me through your strategy.
Well, let me respond to that by making three overall reflections on this. And it's clear since about a week we have more or less taken away the restrictions in Sweden. But I think it's important that we don't see this pandemic as an individual or social issue. It's also a geopolitical issue. It's a security issue. And we just see this pandemic as a tip of an iceberg. There is much more to come, unfortunately. I mean, it's antibiotic resistance, it's all those climate-related change that will also affect human beings. Just a few days ago, I presented the yearly declaration on foreign policy in the Swedish Parliament, and I actually appointed an ambassador to fight antibiotic resistance because there are so many people dying of this. Even if we are concentrating on COVID right now, this is nothing that is going to go away. Also, these geopolitical tensions are actually threatening public health. And that's why we as foreign minister are so involved also in this discussion. There is also the issue of inequality, which means that is crystal clear during the pandemic that the advantage such as vaccine has been very distributed in a very unequal way. And we need to get it in another way to make progress possible for everybody. The health issue is connected across the world. That's what the pandemic has shown us. And inequalities and inequities has increased during the pandemics. And we witness a backsliding also when it comes to gender equality. And both I and Melanie, we are representing governments that has a feminist foreign policy. What we have done also is to see that women has been much more severely hurt by the consequences of the COVID. Not COVID itself, but the consequences of COVID. So we actually started to do to bring this up as in our female foreign ministers network, and we managed to get actually a resolution through in the United Nations to see to this, because the women are being in those areas of society that has been hit the worst by the pandemic. Also part of our way of handling the pandemic has been not to have lockdowns. And in lockdowns, women has been both subjected to domestic violence, UN Women say in an increase with 30%, and also those who have to homeschool their children. So it's not just COVID and pandemic, it's the consequences of the COVID pandemic that we have to deal with as well.
Yeah. Bill, I want you to weigh in on this specifically in terms of what we've seen over the last 24 hours, G20 finance ministers meeting and essentially trying to figure out how to balance the need for economies to get back on track post-COVID and the need to combat inflation. What's your greatest concern there as economies begin to open up again?
Well, the greatest damage to the most low-income countries was the economic damage. The age structure of their population and a variety of things meant, from a pure medical point of view, this is a rare disease that struck middle-income and rich countries dramatically more than low-income. Usually it's dramatically the other way. And, I think it's great when a disease like this, there's one small benefit to it, that it reminds people how inequitable global health is every single day. There's 60 times difference in what's spent per person. There's, a 40 times difference in terms of the risk of a child dying. So we live in a very inequitable world. And in terms of how we take our limited resources and improve those inequities, I do think a dialogue with the countries involved will be important. Would they like to take resources and catch up on bed nets? Would they like to catch up on vaccinations? What are their priorities, given that they weren't able to go out and borrow money and support their economies like the rest of the world was? What is that agenda? We're going to see, an uptick in malaria deaths, an uptick in TB deaths, an uptick in HIV deaths. All of those things were negatively affected. And so it's, great now we can have this dialogue. We've got some generosity that's coming from people realizing that this affected the entire world. And, let's make sure we maximize that and, spend it in the best way possible.
Is inflation, in your view, the greatest danger at this point to the global economic recovery post-pandemic?
Say again?
Is inflation the biggest danger post-pandemic?
Well, African countries have inflation at all times. In the West, yes, we forgot about inflation. We don't have much of it, but it's fairly extreme. We have commodity markets, particularly maize and wheat, with spiking prices. And so, yes, I was in Pakistan yesterday, and the biggest concern there is actually the inflation, because in that food basket, it affects the poor in a pretty dramatic way. There's different factors for why different products are having inflation. But whenever the rich world gets preoccupied with its own problems, there's a temptation to sort of forget about the suffering and the need to be generous to these other countries. And, will that happen this time or not? Partly it's making sure that we, bear witness to the difficulties that these countries have, and, make sure that, we do a better job than we did in the early stage of the epidemic.
Comfort, when you think about what happens next with regard to the most vulnerable populations, obviously we have what's happening with Ukraine-Russia crisis. You've got oil prices that have popped above 95 at different points in the last several days. Inflation, as we were just discussing, is a big concern as we try to move forward through a recovery process for post-pandemic. How difficult do you believe is it going to be for vulnerable countries going forward to get the kind of assistance they need when it comes to funding post-pandemic?
And I want to pick up with your point, but also what you were saying about one of the issues that's been exposed as a result of the pandemic, or further exposed as the result of the pandemic, is the unevenness and also the inequity of the international system. And the other thing that I think has been exposed is the lack of cooperation and unity in terms of being able to identify where those needs were very quickly as well. So today we have a situation where only 4%, for example, of the vaccines have reached those countries that have a high level of a humanitarian crisis as well. So we talk about, evenness, we talk about equity, and yet when you look close to the ground, you still see that the system itself is unable to make sure that it can guarantee access to those populations that are at the front line of the greatest needs as well. So I think one of the things that we talk about building back better, are we going to build back better the humanitarian system? Are we going to build back better to ensure that we deal with those societies that are most at the front line of the crisis? Are we going to build back better in terms of multilateral cooperation? Because we also saw at the time of an international global crisis, the Security Council, for example, was at the most dysfunctional because of those major power tensions. And we've seen how major power tensions has been overshadowed a lot of these crises as well. So when we talk about build back better, it's become a catch-all phrase. And it's become very flimsy on the ground where you at the front line when you see in a lot of these crises. Are you going to build back better in terms of public health systems in a number of these countries? One of the good outcomes from the Ebola crisis, for example, was the unity of the Security Council that enabled also regional organizations like the African Union to benefit from consensus that led to the creation of CDCs around the African continent, for example, that allowed for a more sort of global policy on building public health systems as well. So when we talk about build back better, we've got to be more specific, more concrete, and more clear in terms of what it means for a number of those countries that are vulnerable. Some of those countries that are vulnerable are actually in Western democracies as well, and we've seen just how fragile the distrust is between central governments and also the societies in a lot of Western countries as well. And that, I think, is something that we need to also square the circle with going forward.
I want to just do a quick round robin with the panelists. Covering this from the very beginning as a journalist, you're reacting moment to moment. My actual last interview with Dr. Tedros, who will be joining us in a few minutes, was in Saudi Arabia on a humanitarian crisis panel. And at the time, markets were beginning to react to what we did or didn't know about what was coming. And I asked him at the time, are markets overreacting? And he said, yes, we haven't even declared it a pandemic yet. Now, of course, in hindsight being what it is, that was something quickly to have taken back off the table. But just walk us through, if the candidates would briefly, how much the media and, frankly, disinformation has hurt the world's ability, frankly, to deal with the pandemic.
Well, we are very, very concerned with, and I'm very concerned with the issue of disinformation and misinformation. When it comes to the pandemic, when it comes to our democracy. Let's start with the pandemic. We know that vaccine hesitancy is linked also to the fact that there are social media campaigns that are spreading false information regarding the origin of the virus, its impacts, and also the impacts of vaccines. We see that throughout the world, this is having an impact in democracies and in countries which have and Comfort could talk more about that, but have had some issues in terms of trusting their public health authorities. But these entire misinformation and disinformation campaigns
It's understandable that they'd have a problem trusting their health authorities when you have Dr. Fauci giving new information every single day.
Well,
no offense to him and his knowledge,
but we know that science evolve, and definitely the idea was to make sure that we were following science. But when you don't trust your public health authorities, you put people's lives at risk. So what we want to do as a country is we want to convene experts to find out what are these narratives, who is behind them, how are they affecting communities, and what's the best way to counter them. And I think as a world, we need to come to the table to find a solution because it is for this pandemic and this crisis, but there will be other crises. And we need to know how we can be more resilient to it as every single of our citizens are on the web and became even more in a virtual reality during the pandemic.
Bill, how well do you think the media has done at policing itself when getting the facts right? And did it damage the world's ability to fight this pandemic?
Well, I think the mainstream media did a reasonably good job. You know, it's a little too bad that the death number that was published daily didn't say, you know, unvaccinated X percent, you know, vaccinated Y percent, because then people would have seen the, you know, phenomenal difference in terms of risk of dying being somebody who wasn't vaccinated. So, you know, maybe next time we'll find a better way to get that message out. The scale of the misinformation, once you move past the mainstream media, is so wild you almost have to laugh about it. I mean, you know, Dr. Fauci and I are just killing millions of people to make money. You know, hydroxychloroquine is this miracle cure that somehow he and I have masterminded, avoiding people saving their lives by taking this thing. There's no doubt that the misinformation enhanced vaccine hesitancy, and that maps to hundreds of thousands of deaths. There's no doubt that the idea that, you know, we need the freedom not to wear a mask, you know, and that's some, you know, thing that you've got to show, that in many cases that led to spreading the disease into locations where elderly people had very high death rates. And so, you know, as we look back over the pandemic, you know, having the politicians speak out, that doesn't work very well, because then you have a lack of trust. The CDC in our country could have been more front and center. Dr. Fauci became front and center. And, you know, the key messages about the vaccine is good, you should take it, and some level of mask wearing is good. I don't think he ever confused anybody about the primary messages that saved lives.
What about masks? I think there are a lot of people in America who are confused about whether they should be wearing a mask. And in the United Kingdom, for example, they've scrapped that altogether.
Well, that's interesting. You know, what is the downside of wearing a mask? I mean, it's got to be tough. You know, you have to wear pants. I mean, this is tough stuff. These societies are so cruel. Why do they make you wear pants? I'm trying to figure it out.
We're very glad you have yours on.
That will be on the web. For sure will be on the web.
Foreign Minister, weigh in on this. In terms of Sweden specifically, do you think that the media helped or hurt your ability to fight the pandemic and to move out of it as quickly as you have?
Can you repeat it?
Sure. In terms of the media approach in your country, how did it help or hurt your ability to get back to business as usual, to open up?
With the media?
Yeah.
Well,
misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah, I think in the beginning there was a lot of very strong opinions about what was good, what was bad. There was a debate, anything. And I think it's very clear that the fact that we chose different ways, that we didn't have, for example, masks more than in very, very specific circumstances, is also because of the culture you have, if you trust the authorities or not. Since we have quite a high level of trust between authorities and the citizens, we asked the citizens to take a lot of personal responsibility and to believe, to use their common sense in a way, and absolutely get vaccinated. That's the number one when the vaccine came. But of course there was a lot of disinformation also in our society. Now when we see the kind of results of the excess death rates and so on, it shows that, for example, Sweden, who got criticized in the beginning, there was so many things I read. I had to answer so many questions for journalists all over the world. And we don't have, actually we have in fact one of the countries with with the smallest number of excess death. Yes, we have number 5. And that means that you can choose different ways of fighting the pandemic that is suitable to your circumstances.
Yeah. Comfort, in terms of the most vulnerable areas, As a journalist, I did multiple panels for the last couple of years focusing on everything from the economic fallout to supply chain disruption, and frankly, many on the idea that more needs to be done for the underprivileged areas, for countries of low income, for vaccine distribution, et cetera. But at the end of the day, how many people were really watching those panels? How many people, other than the organizations that were holding them, like this one? My worry would be that the story of the most vulnerable countries was not being told to the degree in which it needed to be. Do you believe that the media has been helpful or more hurtful?
I mean, again, as I said, we've tended to look at the pandemic strictly within a within a public health system. And again, we've learned also over the last 2 years about the fallout and the consequences, and understanding just how extensive those are. This is yet another panel that is trying to understand the post-pandemic situation and how we reframe the conversations and how we do better coming out of the pandemic. There are conversations taking place. They're not often heard in these centres. For example, one of the stories that is often not told is the role, for example, of the African Union and the role of its own chief of CDC and the conversations he had with Africa's heads of states, lessons learned from the Ebola crisis. There are also conversations that are taking place in places like among communities in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Lebanon, also as a result of the protest, as a result of discontent, as a result of those existing grievances. So there are multiple conversations. And when you talk about issues around disinformation, I wouldn't limit it just to the media, and I would also add the social media space where we are all our own media at the end of the day when it comes down to Twitter, to WhatsApp, to Instagram. We all make up our own news at the end of the day in 240 characters, right? I can generate my own spin around the pandemic, and so it plays a double-edged sword as well. But there are other groups that I think we need to focus our attention on. We need to also look at the power of faith groups as well, that can be a source of information, source also of disinformation. We have to also look at various local community groups as well that are also a source of information and a source of disinformation. And by the way, politicians also decide what the news is and how you then craft the message around pandemic. One day we're following the scientist, the other day we're not following the scientist. When it suits us, we follow science. When it doesn't suit the public mood, when we're trying to win the battle in Parliament, it doesn't suit us to follow the scientist because the public mood suggests that we don't want to wear masks anymore, we don't want to be in lockdown anymore, we want to get out, because there are other political imperatives at stake as well. So I think, again, the pandemic has exposed a number of things that we knew were already uneven and unequal in a number of countries, and not just vulnerable countries, but also in sort of what we define as strong democracies. We've seen just how fragile some of those societies are in terms of the trust within their own communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Bill, how confident are you that we as a global community will deal with the next pandemic better?
Well, there were a lot of people in 2015 after the Ebola epidemic who were talking about what needed to be done. And in this pandemic, the countries that had some exposure to SARS-CoV-1 were amongst the outliers. So Australia is a true outlier. They orchestrated diagnostics, they executed quarantine policies, and they have a death rate in a different league than the other rich countries. I mean, just utterly different. And everybody had the capability to do that. They, have less PCR machines than other rich countries. It wasn't something. They had more travelers coming in from China than other countries. So hopefully, given so many negative things, not just the millions of deaths and the economic toll, but the lack of schooling, depression, overdose deaths. I mean, it's hard to make the entire list. As you say, for men, more men died. For women, more women had acceptable burdens thrust onto them. So the cost of being ready for the next pandemic is not super large. It's not like climate change where, 10 trillion, 20 trillion, these are big numbers. A global surveillance capability would cost like $1 billion a year. The R&D that we need to do to get magic vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics, that's less than $100 billion over the next decade. So, if we're rational, yes, the next time we'll catch it early and it won't go global like it did this time.
But I think also that we now have a better health security infrastructure than we did before the pandemic. The ACT accelerator, COVAX are examples. And I think also that many countries in the world know that we need to vaccine more people in order to get out of the pandemic. And that's why we're stepping up to the plate. In Canada, we've provided 200 million vaccines. We've invested $2.6 billion also in treatment and PPE, etc. But I think, Bill, that was not ready before the pandemic. We've worked together through our different multilateral institutions. Comfort, you were referring to the African Union as well. I think that multilateralism worked during the pandemic. It's not perfect, but I think we're stronger than before.
Well, I think there are many weaknesses that was exposed, and I think that maybe it worked, but mostly it did not work because there were until everybody decided now we have to put everything into the goal of getting the vaccine. Then we managed to do it, but that was for public-private cooperation, for multilateral cooperation, for the big institutions to go together. The EU, other organizations like that, and we get the vaccine in a period of time that was unseen. Nobody could expect us to do that, and that was, I think, one of the best things that happened. But it also explored the weaknesses of the multilateral organization. And I hope now that the Secretary General of the United Nations, he is going to have a summit for the future, and so to see how we can make it more robust, because we cannot go on with these inappropriate way of dealing with the multilateralism. Absolutely not.
In terms of reaching the goal, the WHO's goal of vaccinating 70% of the global population by July of 2022, show of hands on this stage, do we think it's going to happen? Do you think it's going to happen?
What?
To get to vaccination of 70% of the population of the world?
No, it's too late.
Too late.
I mean, there's a lot of diseases out there that demand does not exist for that. I mean, countries should be able to set priorities.
Yeah. I'd love to open up the floor for questions at this point. And Dr. Tedros has joined us and will be giving some closing remarks as soon as we're finished. If you have a question, I believe that we have a microphone that we can give you, which is somewhere near here. Sir? Here we go.
Good moment.
Pardon me.
We had a tough time to manage COVID, but good news is we have managed it. Initially, we started vaccination much earlier than other countries, but then we made an arrangement. We paid for AstraZeneca from India, but India had a terrible situation, so they failed to provide the vaccine. Then we're looking for vaccine everywhere. And it was unfortunate. For a few weeks, almost 6 weeks, we had to abandon our vaccination program. Finally, Chinese came forward, and we are lucky they started providing vaccination at a cost. We have to pay for it. Finally, thanks to COVAX, you see, they started coming up. We need a lot of vaccine, not less than 300 million vaccines, because we have around 165 million people. And since we need too much vaccines, not to speak of, the booster, first, and second vaccine, we need a lot. But we face this difficulty. Until today, we got assurance from some of the countries, friendly countries, they would be providing some vaccine for around 1.1 million, displaced people, persecuted people of Myanmar who are currently staying in. Unfortunately, that did not come yet. So we hope that those will flow in future. During this pandemic, we find there was narrowness among many countries. They were not forthcoming with the vaccine until, of course, the COVAX started giving. Thanks to the COVAX and also Director General who arranged it. My question is, I have two parts. First question is, from the day one, we wanted this vaccine to be a public good. And the technology should be shared with the countries. Till today, many African countries don't have it. If the technology could be shared with us, we have the pharmaceutical expertise, we could produce it. But since this technology is not a public good, and therefore we cannot produce it. So is it going to be, because this is coming up in varieties of ways, in variety of variants, so will it be allowed as a public good and the technology to be shared by the countries that can afford to do it? Second part, of course, and here is the Director General is here, for my Rohingya, you see, they live in a very congested area. They need vaccine, and it's not much. It's around, if you do 2 doses, it's only 2 million vaccines. We are providing from our own, but it's not enough because we have we brought plenty of vaccine on our own, and thanks to COVAX that we got some. So these are the two questions I have. Thank you. Thank you, Mari.
Bill, where
is he from?
I didn't.
India, I believe. Bangladesh, excuse me. Bangladesh.
Okay. Well, there's no doubt that given the risk factors of this disease, that vaccinating young people anywhere before we vaccinated older people or people with comorbidities was not a just thing to do. And, it's hard to get the vaccines allocated according to, that risk ordering, which would have been ideal. Because of the second source deal that we helped fund with Serum and AstraZeneca, India actually had vaccines, a lot of vaccines very early. And the rich countries had vaccines early. And so, yes, in the future, there's two solutions. One is to make sure that limited supply is allocated in a more rational way, and there's ways to do that. The second is to just have so much capacity and that you can supply all of mankind 2 doses in a very short period of time. And given this, how easy it is to build very high volume mRNA vaccines, I see the second is more likely. And you can use a mix, but the second one, being able within 6 months to make enough for the world, I think that should be our aspiration.
Do you believe it's possible to prevent the next pandemic?
Say again?
Is it possible to prevent the next pandemic?
Yes, if every country does what Australia did, then you wouldn't be calling it a pandemic. That's all.
Foreign Minister.
Yeah, I would say to your question about this that, I know the criticism that is in your question, and we hear it often, but actually we have seen the fastest development of a safe and effective vaccine in the history of mankind, and it has been the most significant scale-up of global vaccine production. Actually, it's a tripling of the global outcome of vaccine, and that is under the rules that we have now, and under the criticized TRIPS, for example, that I know that your country is talking about. And I think that if we waiver proposal, that would not help, because it will take away incentives for the vaccine producers to deliver the vaccine. But what we should do is, of course, that when we have the vaccine done in the way with the market economy, so to speak, is to propose even harder COVAX system, and that everybody takes the responsibility, and that we increase the effectiveness of supporting all countries. I know it's more than 120 countries now that is not having the vaccine in a very high level, but to go that way of wavering or waivers or taking away trips or getting not the producers to get what they need to have. I think that's the wrong way to go, actually. Sorry.
I think you know what I'm going to say. Here's the statistics. 12% of people have been vaccinated in Africa. 71% have been vaccinated in Europe. I mean, that is the stark reality. That is how uneven the process is as well. The one good story, and I just saw your tweet this morning, Dr. Tedros, is that 6 countries in Africa for themselves have now received the technology to now begin to think through about the vaccination on the continent as well. Again, it talks to the resilience of communities realizing that they're not necessarily going to get what they need and that they can't rely on the traditional multilateral cooperation, which was damaged at the very beginning of COVID because of also the other major power tensions as well. But I think we also need to look at the realities. There really is a divide between what is happening. You asked the question, do we believe that 70% of the people will be vaccinated by 2023? No, and I'm glad that you said so yourself. It's unrealistic because of this crisis that we have within the system. And also, I think we should also be clear, the vaccine diplomacy, using geopolitics as a bargaining chip to decide who gets vaccinated first. Oh, well, because we're not getting what we want from the West, well, then we can turn to Russia, we can turn to China, because the bidding is at a very low base, whereas there are lots of conditions tied, even within the COVAX initiative as well. So I think if we're going to build back better, I think we really need to rethink the multilateral cooperation. And again, I think the public health system has exposed what we already knew about the weakness and the fragility of that multilateral cooperation.
Yeah, well, Anne mentioned a bit earlier the impacts of the pandemic on terms of social, political, economy, and Comfort mentioned it as well. I think that, the pandemic has an impact on our public health systems and our health systems in general. And we are not done dealing with that yet. Well, we're still vaccinating the world. So we have to also work on the resiliency of health systems in Bangladesh and other countries, because meanwhile there are people on the waiting list that are trying to get surgery and don't necessarily have a spot in the hospital. We're going through this in Canada and many countries, but we know we have to do that as well in different countries of the world.
Panelists, I'm afraid we're going to actually have to wrap it up, but Dr. Tedros is going to offer his assessment of where we are today, I believe, in the next 5 minutes. We could get a microphone for Dr. Tedros, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I would have preferred actually, what do you call it, where I could put my paper.
You can sit down.
Would you like to come up?
No. We can add something here, no problem. Please. No. No. Yeah, I can stand here. Just another. Yeah, that's it. I will stand here. That's better.
Dr. Tedros, why don't you sit here?
No.
Good. Oh, people want to see you.
I was supposed to speak while standing, so.
This is what happens when you're late. Not ready for you.
You can say that.
Yes, okay.
So, Bill, I hope to see you with pants.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to apologize. I'm very late. It took us 1 hour to get into Munich from Brussels, almost same time from the airport here. We were stuck in a tunnel. I'm really sorry, but I have to apologize. But I'm glad you were with great panelists. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, guten Abend and good evening. And my thanks to Ambassador Ishinge and his team for bringing us together again. I'm sure when we met 2 years ago, when we were all coming to grips with the spread of this new virus, that none of us would have imagined we would now be entering the 3rd year of the pandemic. So, when will it end? Is it ending now? One of the major questions being asked. Indeed, high vaccine coverage in some countries, combined with the lower severity of Omicron, is driving a dangerous narrative that the pandemic is over. But it's not. Not when 70,000 people a week are dying from a preventable and treatable disease. Not when 83% of the population of Africa is yet to receive a single dose of vaccine. Not when health systems continue to strain and crack under the caseload. Not when we have a highly transmissible virus circulating almost unchecked, with too little surveillance to track its evolution. In fact, conditions are ideal for more transmissible, more dangerous variants to emerge. But we can end the pandemic as a global health emergency this year. We have the tools, we have the know-how. In particular, we're calling on all countries to fill the urgent financing gap of $16 billion for the ACT Accelerator to make vaccines, tests, treatments, and PPE available everywhere. Compared with the costs of another year of economic turmoil, $16 billion is frankly peanuts, and some finance ministers called it a rounding error to the money they're losing due to the pandemic. Ending this pandemic must remain our focus. At the same time, we must learn the lessons it's teaching us. As you know, there have been many reviews of the global response to this pandemic with more than 200 recommendations. Taking those recommendations into account, last month's WHO's Executive Board tasked me with developing a set of proposals on strengthening the global architecture for pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, to be considered by all member states at the World Health Assembly in May. In brief, I see 3 key pillars of that architecture. First, we need stronger governance. I think that has been raised by the panelists. Instead of the confusion and incoherence that has fueled this pandemic, we need cooperation and collaboration in the face of common threats that can address the trust deficit that we have seen. At a special session of the World Health Assembly at the end of last year, WHO's 194 member states agreed to negotiate a new legally binding instrument to set the rules of the game for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. WHO also supports the recommendations for heads of state council to provide high-level political leadership for rapid and coordinated action. In our view, such a council must be anchored in the constitutional mandate of WHO to ensure political, strategic, and technical coherence. Second, we need stronger systems and tools to prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to epidemics and pandemics. Already, WHO has taken steps to build some of these systems and tools, including the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence in Berlin, to enhance global surveillance through collaborative intelligence. We are piloting the WHO BioHub system, a new mechanism for countries to share novel biological materials. Several countries are now piloting the Universal Health Preparedness Review, a new peer review mechanism for enhancing national preparedness. We established the ACT Accelerator, which has given us valuable experience and insights into how to fast-track equitable access to countermeasures and to strengthen capacities for local production of vaccines and other health products in low and middle-income countries. We have established the WHO Technology Transfer Hub in South Africa, which has now developed its own mRNA COVID-19 vaccine candidate. Today, we announced the first 6 African countries to receive technology from the hub to produce their own mRNA vaccines: Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tunisia. But above all, not only the systems and tools, the central point will be developing the workforce. And that's why the WHO Academy we're building in Lyon, France. And third, we need stronger financing. It's obvious that nationally and globally, we need substantial resources for strengthening global health security. Our analysis estimates the needs at $31 billion per year. We estimate that about $20 billion could come from existing and projected domestic and international resources, leaving a gap of $10 billion per year. To close the gap for the most essential functions, such as surveillance, research, and market shaping for countermeasures, we support the idea of a new dedicated financing facility anchored in and directed by WHO's constitutional mandate, inclusive governance, and technical expertise and installed in the World Bank. Any efforts to strengthen the global health security architecture can only succeed if they also strengthen WHO's role at its center, rather than creating further mechanisms that would only create further fragmentation and potentially leave the world less safe. We especially appreciate Germany's leadership of the Member States Working Group on Sustainable Financing, and we look forward to our continuing discussion with our Member States on ensuring WHO has the resources to meet the world's expectations of it, as well as accountability for delivering against those expectations. Let me return to the question I asked at the beginning: when will the pandemic end? It will end when we choose to end it, because ultimately it's not a matter of chance, it's a matter of choice. Vielen Dank. I thank you. And excuse me again, my apologies for joining you late. Thank you.
Dr. Tedros, one question. Bill says that we could potentially prevent another pandemic if we all act like Australia. Do you agree?
It depends on our choices, of course, and how prepared we are. And we have been saying the world has not been prepared for a long time. And it was caught by surprise due to this pandemic. Still, I don't see that the world is prepared. And I worry because of that, because the investment we expect is not happening. So, can a pandemic be prevented in a state like now? I don't think so.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, panelists.
And John.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.